Steve, is present the lamb to the priest. Now place your hands on the head of the lamb, Steve.
Why do I do that?
That's the way you dedicate it to God. Then the lamb becomes a substitute for you.
Why do I need a substitute?
There are certain things you can't do on your own. What did the Savior do for you that you couldn't do for yourself?
He died for my sins.
The atonement was something we couldn't do for ourselves. We needed a Savior who could act as a substitute for us.
The shadows of sacrament. According to René Girard's mimetic theory, just as the research into mirror neurons suggests, our desires are influenced by other people's desires.
What's this for?
You have to kill the lamb, Steve.
Why does the lamb have to die? He didn't do anything wrong.
Neither did the Savior.
You don't love her and she doesn't love you back and you know it!
When drawn towards the same object of desire,
I must show you something.
when drawn towards the same object of desire,
Where is she?
tensions increase and rivalries emerge. A cumulative resentment and vengeance then becomes likely to produce a state of Hobbesian radical crisis of all against all. Quote, the most, or rather the only effective form of reconciliation that would stop this crisis and save the community from total self-destruction is the convergence of all collective anger and rage towards a random victim, a scapegoat, pharmakon. Designated by mimetism itself, and unanimously adopted as such, in the frenzy of the mimetic violence of the mob, a focal point suddenly appears in the shape of the culprit, who is thought to be the cause of the disorder and the one who brought the crisis into the community. He is singled out and unanimously killed by the community. He isn't any guiltier than any other, but the whole community strongly believes he is. The killing of the scapegoat ends the crisis, since the transference against it is unanimous. That is the importance of the scapegoat mechanism. It channels the collective violence against one arbitrarily chosen member of the community, and this victim becomes the common enemy of the entire community, which is reconciled as a result.
Before anyone else can claim this honor, I desire to be sacrificed. For the sake of my family. For the sake of all of you.
Here, Girard brilliantly traces the ritual of Christian sacrifice from an evolution out of the God of the Old Testament. This God, which intervenes in the last moment to save Isaac before Abraham is able to fulfill his ritual sacrifice, is one step towards the creation of increasingly peaceful rituals, especially in comparison to the more violent human and infant sacrifices of the past. Transferring the violence of ritual onto a lamb is hypothesized to be the first iteration of renouncing violence. Christianity, in turn, is characterized by Christ's imperative to turn the cheek as being the epitomic break from an age-old mimetic feedback loop of accumulated rivalries resulting in sacrificial denouements.
Let him among you who is without sin cast the first stone.
From Girard's view, Derrida is really commending a Christian imperative of rebirth retained in Nietzsche's third Metamorphoses, when crediting him for having awakened us to the responsibilities that are not our own. Ultimately, the Bible provides not merely a replacement of the object to be sacrificed, but the end of the sacrificial order in its entirety, thanks to the consenting victim who is Jesus Christ. Whereas Abrahamic sacrifice attempted to distance ritual from human sacrifice, Christian sacrifice is an attempt to break from the prior rituals of sacrifice altogether. Zizek once again sharpens the analysis by referencing the work of Jean-Pierre Dupuy. Quoting Zizek, "This eventuality reaches its apogee in Christ, who is the figure of a pure event, the exact opposite of the habitual. The story is not told by collective staging of sacrifice, but by the victim, from the standpoint of the victim whose full innocence is thereby asserted. The radical break introduced by Christianity consists in the fact that it is the first religion without the sacrifice, a religion whose unique achievement is precisely to demystify the sacred." In Zizek's work, Meditation on Michelangelo's Christ on the Cross, we find a discussion of G.K. Chesterton regarding various moments where God is split. In other religions, you pray to God, but only in Christianity does God pray to himself. Iterated through the book of Job, where on the question of suffering, God insists on the inexplicableness of everything. That is, instead of omniscience, God himself seems overwhelmed at the excesses of his creation. For Zizek, God's own incredulity towards himself comes to fruition in Christ's moment of madness, finitude, and doubt on the cross, while crying, "Ilahi!" "Ilahi!" This rupture from the past comes not only from how God, an absolute, is doubting himself while going forth to die a particularly atheistic death.
The idea is that Judaism persists in this anxiety, like God remains this enigmatic, terrifying other. And then Christianity resolved the tension through love. By sacrificing his son, God demonstrates that he loves us. So it's a kind of a imaginary, sentimental, even resolution of a situation of radical anxiety.
Forgive.
If this were to be the case, then Christianity would have been kind of ideological reversal or pacification of the deep, much more shattering Jewish insight. But I think one can read the Christian gesture in a much more radical way. This is what the sequence of crucifixion in Scorsese's film shows us. What dies on the cross is precisely this guarantee of the big other. The message of Christianity is here radically atheist. It's the death of Christ is not any kind of redemption or commercial affair in the sense of Christ suffers to pay for our sins, pay to whom, for what, and so on. It's simply the disintegration of the God which guarantees the meaning of our lives. And that's the meaning of that famous phrase, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Father, why have you forsaken me?
Father! Why have you forsaken me?
Just before Christ's death, we get what in psychoanalytic terms we call subjective destitution. Stepping out totally of the domain of symbolic identification. Cancelling or suspending the entire field of symbolic authority, the entire field of the big other. Of course, we cannot know what God wants from us because there is no God. This is the Jesus Christ who says, among other things, I bring sword, not peace. If you don't hate your father, your mother, you are not my follower. Of course, this doesn't mean that you should actively hate or kill your parents. I think that family relations stand here for hierarchic social relations. The message of Christ is, I'm dying, but my death itself is good news. It means you are alone, left to your freedom, be in the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, which is just the community of believers. It's wrong to think that the second coming will be that Christ as a figure will return somehow. Christ is already here when believers form an emancipatory collective. This is why I claim that the only way really to be an atheist is to go through Christianity. Christianity is much more atheist than the usual atheism, which can claim there is no God and so on, but nonetheless it retains a certain trust into the big other. This big other can be called natural necessity, evolution, or whatever. We humans are nonetheless reduced to a position within a harmonious whole of evolution, whatever. But the difficult thing to accept is, again, that there is no big other, no point of reference which guarantees meaning.
And I mean by this, we don't really know what happens to Christ in the 3 days on the cross, and this is a matter subject to theological dispute. This rupture also comes from an individual perspective, where an innocence of the victim is revealed and takes precedence over the collective perspective regarding the efficacy of ritual. The perspective of innocence is illustrated well by Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John on the Cross, where the empathetic point of view is seen from Christ on downward. The audience sympathizes not with the past justifications given for ritual, which was perhaps needed to uphold collective unity, but instead with the treatment and finitude of an individual. This is pre-humanist.
The first thing I do when I meet an atheist is I congratulate him. I congratulate him because he says he does not believe in God. The reason I congratulate him is all the other human beings, most of them, they are blindly following their parents. The Christian, he is a Christian because father is a Christian. The person is a Hindu because father is a Hindu. Most of the Muslims are Muslims because their fathers are Muslim. This atheist is thinking his father, his parents may be religious, but he does not believe in the gods which his parents worship. The reason I congratulate him is because he has said the first part of the Islamic Shahada, Islamic creed, La ilaha, there is no God. The only thing I have to do is illallah, but Allah, which I shall do inshallah. Half my job is done. To the other non-Muslim, first I have to prove to him that the God he is worshipping is the wrong God. is a false god, and then prove to him what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here, half my job is done. He has already said the first part of the Islamic Shahada, La ilaha. So my job, half my job is done. I have to only prove illallah, which I shall do inshallah.
I interpret the Islamic Shahada, La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but God, as an implicit acknowledgement and refutation of this Christian humanist atheism. While the Shahada holds that one becomes a genuine believer of God only after one has survived the doubts of atheism, Zizek contends that one can only become an atheist through the spirit of desacralization found in Christian revelation. Here we can look to Martin Luther, where he says, "It is certain that a man must completely despair of himself to become fit to obtain the grace of Christ." Zizek attempts to fulfill his secret dream to become Hegel's Luther through a Lacanian de-universalization of the Hegelian universalist subject. It is this spirit throughout the third manuscript where Marx ties together the concept of alienation with the superseding evolutions of religiosity, which is also the spirit or Geist that Hegel evokes. Such an evolution can be traced from the inception of Paulinian Christianity through to the Council of Nicaea and reanimated by Protestant reformations. This is the Marxist Hegelian dialectic, defining the stages upon which spirit progresses towards perhaps what may be called freedom.
It's not, are we free or not, is there God or not? It asks a simple question, which would be called a hermeneutic question. What does it mean to be free?
Quoting Marx's third manuscript, he notes, "Just as Luther recognizes religion, faith, as the substance of the external world and in consequence stood opposed to Catholic paganism, just as he superseded external religiosity by making religiosity the inner substance of man, just as he negated the priests outside the laymen because he transplanted the priests into laymen's hearts, just so with wealth. Wealth as something outside man and independent of him, and therefore as something to be maintained and asserted only in an external fashion, is done away with."
Jerusalem! The faithful city! She that was full of justice has become a harlot! Stop him! Have you not heard?
That is, this external, mindless objectivity of wealth is done away with.
Stop making my father's house a marketplace!
The Jewish authorities came back at him with a question.
What miracle can you perform to show us that you have the right to do this?
Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again.
Are you going to build it again in 3 days?
It has taken 46 years to build this temple.
But the temple Jesus was speaking about was his body.
with private property being incorporated in man himself, and with man himself being recognized as its essence. But as a result, man is brought within the orbit of private property, just as with Luther, he is brought within the orbit of religion.
The bundle of rights that Locke envisioned every person possessing also included the right to one's labor. This means that individuals have a right to the fruits of their physical labor, as well as their ingenuity, creativity, and innovation. Locke also explained how we can come to have property rights in land or other natural resources, rights not based in political decree or favoritism. The key for Locke was what he called labor mixing, which occurs when a person uses their physical labor, ideas, imagination, and creativity to transform previously unused physical material. For example, Joe and Sarah arrive in the New World and find an unclaimed area of land. They begin a process of transforming the land to build a farm. According to Locke, this labor is how Joe and Sarah acquire rights over the land. Property rights over the products produced on the farm is an important addition because it means that Joe and Sarah have the right to decide how best to use their crop. They can consume it or trade it with people for other goods and services they might need.
His 1905 book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was concerned with how Protestant thought underpinned the development of capitalism. Weber argued that the spirit of capitalism lay behind the unplanned growth of capitalism in the 19th century. He defined this spirit as the belief in pursuing ever-increasing profit from economic activity. Importantly, Weber believed that this spirit does not tolerate greed, but rather encourages hard work to make and invest profits. Capitalists should refrain from living luxuriously, but should always prioritize work. Weber believed that this spirit developed directly from ascetic Protestantism. Ascetic beliefs require that people renounce physical pleasures and comfort in the pursuit of greater spiritual fulfillment. In particular, Weber considered ascetic Protestantism's idea of a calling. This is the notion that humans have one task set by God, and one proves one's faith to God by working at it. This, for Weber, underpins the spirit of capitalism. In addition, Weber paid particular attention to capitalism's relationship to Calvinism, a branch of Protestantism. Calvinism held that whether someone would go to heaven or hell was predestined. View, by earning greater wealth, followers could convince themselves that they were destined for salvation.
Under the semblance of recognizing man, the political economy, whose principle is labor, rather carries to its logical conclusion the denial of man, since man himself no longer stands in an external relation of tension to the external substance of private property, but has become himself this tense essence of private property. What was previously being external to himself, man's actual externalization, has merely become the act of externalizing, the process of alienating. This political economy begins by seeming to acknowledge man, his independence, spontaneity, etc. Then, locating private property in man's own being, it can no longer be conditioned by the local, national, or other characteristics of private property as of something existing outside itself. Dupuy responds to these ideas by saying that Christianity, or at least what modernity was to make of it, became the driving force behind the progressive elimination of all taboos, all prohibitions, all limits. In the meantime, science itself has taken over the religions of the Bible in bringing about this desacralization by stripping nature of its prescriptive or normative value. It is this spirit of self-negation that evokes a continual, quote, atheistic, quote, negation, the self-criticism involved in the splitting of absolutes, from the theological as per God's restraint of killing Isaac, God's bewilderment of his own creation in the book of Job, and the self-doubt, Cartesian-like madness, and the disenchantment experienced on the cross that motivates practical evaluations that provoke debate, religious reformation, political revolution, and even scientific progress. The original meaning of revolution was to revolve back into what was already the case. However, this is perhaps also the spirit of contemporary despiritualization and alienation. Adorno writes, "The last grandly conceived theorem of bourgeois self-criticism has become a means of making bourgeois self-alienation in its final phase absolute and of rendering ineffectual the lingering awareness of the ancient wound in which lies the hope of a better future.
The Women's Liberation Front is a hate group, pure and simple. And when a hate group comes into town to attack the rights of trans women, it is a women's issue.
Wolf aggressively advocates a sex as gender understanding of human identity that erases trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people from what we imagine them to be as human.
From Kierkegaard's exploration of the absurd, this thesis brings us back to the idea of changing the center from that which is most peripheral, yet still from within. In the assertion that an omnipotent and omniscient being manifested itself as a finite human, the primary locus of Kierkegaard's faith is expressed as the utmost absurd form of paradox. As the exact opposite of the habitual, Christ's crucifixion is astounding, for a divine figure is mortally punished, which is a completely alien and absurd notion that shattered worldviews in comparison to past imaginations regarding what a savior should look like.
Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter, this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many.
You know why I came to Jerusalem?
Yes. This is where the revolution is going to begin.
Last night Isaiah came to me. He had a prophecy. I saw it written. It said, "He has borne our faults. He was wounded for our transgressions, yet he opened not his mouth. Despised and rejected by all, he went forward without resisting, like a lamb led to the slaughter."
I don't understand.
Judas, I am the lamb. I'm the one who's going to die.
Die? You mean you're not the Messiah?
I am.
That can't be. If you're the Messiah, why do you have to die?
Listen, at first, I didn't understand
Now
myself.
you listen. Every day you have a different plan. First it's love, then it's the axe, and now you have to die.
Edward Said reiterates this language of fragmentation when explaining how Christianity shatters the classical balance between high and low styles, just as Christ's life destroys the separation between the sublime and the everyday. Here is the inception of Messianic time, illustrated by Christ's skeptical words against the prophets of doom.
I'm here to set fire to the world! In the desert, the Baptists warned us God is coming! Well, I'm telling you, it's too late. He's already here. I'm here! And I'm going to baptize everybody with fire!
Quoting Zizek, if we reject the kingdom, that is, if violence is not universally and categorically renounced, all that is left to us is a game of immense hazard and jeopardy that amounts to constantly playing with fire. We cannot risk coming too close, lest we perish in a nuclear holocaust. This is the principle of existential deterrence. Nor can we risk standing too far away, lest we forget the danger of nuclear weapons. This is the Jonah paradox. We must neither believe too much in fate, nor refuse too much to believe in it. We must, that is, believe in fate exactly as one believes in a work of fiction. In principle, the dialectic of fate and chance permits us to keep just the right distance from the black hole of catastrophe. Since apocalypse is our fate, we are bound to remain tied to it. But since an accident has to take place in order for our destiny to be fulfilled, we are kept apart from it. In Mark 13, Christ warns that during the end days there will be false prophets pointing to signs of apocalypse and doom in all directions.
I mean, I didn't choose that, hey, in the end times, before the second coming of Christ, we're going to have to be ripping face about a bunch of perverts and homos. I didn't choose this fight. This fight has come to us. And you know what I say? Bring it on!
Though they will only lead people astray. This existential deterrence is, for Walter Benjamin, a messianic cessation of happening. Quoting Benjamin, a historical materialist approaches a historical subject only where he encounters it as a monad, referring to Spinoza. In this structure, he recognizes the sign of a messianic cessation of happening, or, put differently, a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past. Existential deterrence is, for Walter Benjamin, a messianic cessation of happening.
You shall not pass!
Through Zizek's Lacanian Hegelian lens, the contemporary resurfacing of monadic spirituality, exemplified by Jungian-inspired New Age mysticism,
another beautiful situation. There's another beautiful relationship, that you need to step into. So, don't be afraid to cut ties. Don't be afraid to walk away. Don't be afraid to love them from a distance, okay? What else does your future self want you to know? All right, we have the meerkat.
Californian Buddhisms.
When it came down to it, we didn't know what we ought to say because we really don't know what to do. Some things that we might do, for example, to increase the food supply with high-yield crops, may be ecological mistakes. And so the consensus of almost everybody at the meeting was that in some way or other, the human race has to learn how to leave the world alone and let what is called the natural homeostasis, that is the self-balancing process of nature, take care of the mess. Now, how are we going to do that?
I'm not against pollution because humanity, through our hubris, we disturb the balance of the Mother Earth, so we should live more modestly and so on. I think the situation is much more crazy and difficult. Maybe Earth is our mother, but it's an evil bitch. It's a horrible mother. Just think about oil. Can you even imagine what terrifying ecological catastrophes must have happened so that we have oil today? So what I mean is that that's the tragedy. There is no ecological balance, zero level to which we can return. No, we live in an open, crazy, contingent universe.
Neo-Spinozisms.
Ask the big question, is there a God? Is there a meaning to everything, right?
Right.
And here's how Einstein answered the question. He said, there really are two kinds of gods. We have to be very scientific. We have to define what you mean by God. If God is the God of intervention, the personal God, the God of prayer, the God that parts the waters, then he had a hard time believing in that. Would God listen to all our prayers for a bicycle for Christmas and smite the Philistines for me, please?
Right.
He didn't think so. However, he believed in the God of order, harmony, beauty, simplicity, and elegance, the God of Spinoza.
Naturalisms, pantheism, vitalism, and resuscitated paganisms are all ideological paradigms that deprioritize this messianic cessation. In addition to, but different from the usual critiques of capitalists' commodity brand fetishism,
Rather than a commodity being a material product of human labor, it is bounded with metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties.
we can include celebrity worship, nationalism, leader idolatry,
And we come from 300 kilometers to visit, to see now Erdogan.
as well as the adoration of monarchy that continues to persist today.
Leven de koning!
For Zizek, these symptoms result from the incomplete realization that the only radical alternative to the madness of the conditions of postmodernity lead to a dangerous reversion to an even worse madness of religious fundamentalism, a violent retreat into some artificially resuscitated tradition.
What do you think led you to be a shaman?
It was my calling since I was a child, but in all honesty, I always wanted to know what the Native Americans understood. I knew that they had something.
I think myself that identity politics is not a good thing.
Quoting Zizek, "The problem for those in power is how to get people to do the dirty work without turning them into monsters." This was Heinrich Himmler's dilemma. When confronted with the task of killing Jews of Europe, the SS adopted the attitude of somebody has to do the dirty job. In Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, the philosopher describes how Nazi executioners endured the horrible acts they performed. Most were well aware that they were doing things that brought humiliation, suffering, and death to their victims. The way out of this predicament was that instead of saying, "What horrible things I did to people," they would say, "What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties, how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders." In this way, they were able to turn around the logic of resisting temptation. The temptation to be resisted was pity and sympathy in the presence of human suffering, the temptation not to murder, torture, and humiliate. There was a further ethical problem for Himmler: how to make sure that the executioners, while performing these terrible acts, remain human and dignified.
Also the solution by, I wonder if you share this pessimism of mine, another one by Himmler. You know what was his sacred book I read? He all the time had a special leather-bound copy in his pocket, Bhagavad Gita. He said, his problem was this one, he puts it perfectly. Nazi officers have to do SS horrible things. How to enable them to do it without themselves becoming horrible beings? His solution was Oriental wisdom. To learn to act from distance, I am not really there.
His answer was Krishna's message to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. Himmler always had in his pocket a leather-bound edition. Act with inner distance, do not get fully involved. The scene that Zizek is referring to is in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna appears during Arjuna's hesitation before a great battle, and he is faced with the decision to order his armies to kill an opposing side, who are family members.
और ये सारी सृष्टि स्वयं परमात्मा के लिए है पार, जो इस तथ्य को जान लेता है उसे धर्म का मार्ग सदा ही स्पष्ट दिखाई देता है। हाँ बात इस युद्ध में विध्वंस होगा, अवश्य होगा।
Zizek's assessment is actually a refined iteration of Hegel's critique about Hinduism's reliance on abstract universality and unity as a contribution to his argument of the historical stages that lead towards the West and the culmination of a German national spirit, Volksgeist. However, here I will critique this point of view using Spivak's critique of post-colonial reason, where she refutes these very interpretations of Hinduism on the grounds that they are historically contingent extrapolations made to fit Hegel's pre-formulated Euro-teleological normativity. Spivak explains that the limited translations of Indian thought available for Western audiences exaggerated the importance of the Bhagavad Gita in comparison to a complex history that included other texts that were in dialogue with one another. These include texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Indeed, Randall Collins's vivid explanation of how colonialism shaped the evolution of Hindu thought concurs with Spivak's perspective. Though similar forms of syncretism also took place in Hindu thought with the emergence of Islam in India during the 1500s, the substantial power imbalances between the European colonizers and the incredibly diverse range of thought in India forced the consolidation of a degraded set of ideals for the sake of the solidification and the protection of culture.
Should we issue a warning, sir? They've had their warning. No meetings.
Before this time, Hindu, Jain, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Islamic thought in India were mired in endless diffusions, debate and conversation, and guru rivalry, and were not subject to massive power imbalances. Even sophisticated discussions, mirroring, for example, the conversations between Humean and Kantian thought, can be found disguised within religious rhetoric. With the arrival of the British frigates, however, came a renewed motivation to strengthen a caste system, even though this system had already been crumbling under the prior weight of vibrant and complex dialogue. That is, unwittingly, the arrival of the British reinforced a dying caste system. Quoting Randall Collins, "These modern philosophers syncretized positions whose political underpinnings had been weakened. They pulled together a Hindu national philosophy in united front against European colonial domination after 1800, and contrasted it as sharply as possible with modern European secularism and materialism. Just at this time, the concept of a unitary Hindu culture was formulated, first by British administrators, then embraced by Indian nationalists themselves." This kind of historical ethnocide is one of the less recognized aspects of colonialism because it's covered up by modern-day nationalism. This narrative affirms Collins' thesis that widely accepted ideals, philosophies, and religions tend to fragment into factions, while more insecure ideals tend to reinforce themselves through syncretic unification, which is his main thesis.
The Russian Orthodox Church has broken ties with the leader of the worldwide Orthodox community. The fight is being compared to the greatest Orthodox split since the schism with Catholicism in 1054. Why? The worldwide leader, ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, last week granted Ukrainian clerics their independence from Moscow. They had been under Russian leadership since the 1600s. Russia's Metropolitan Hilarion calls the decision, quote, lawless and canonically void, and says it might lead to a deep religious rift in Ukraine. Joining me now is Metropolitan Jonah Puffhausen, former Archbishop of Washington, primate of the Orthodox Church in America, now serving in the jurisdiction, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Metropolitan Jonah, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
What does this mean?
Basically, what it means is that there is a break in communion. There's not a full split, but there's a break in communion between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Church of Constantinople.
And what does that mean for the faithful?
Well, what it means in Russia is something that very different than what it means in America. In Russia, it means that Russians on vacation in Turkey can't go to church and receive communion. In the United States, it means that members of the Russian Orthodox Church and members of the Greek Orthodox Church aren't supposed to go to church together.
Было принято решение о полном разрыве евхаристического общения с Константинопольским патриархатом. Это было вынужденное решение, но иного решения не мог принять наш Священный Синод, поскольку к этому вела вся логика последних действий Константинопольского патриархата. Пока эти беззаконные и антиканоничные решения с точки зрения Константинополя остаются в силе, мы не сможем находиться в общении с этой церковью, оказавшейся сегодня в расколе.
A similar story of how ideological structures tend to consolidate in response to modern Westphalian state structures can be told with regards to colonial struggles generally around the world. For example, both the Islamic State of Iran and the secular monarchical regime that preceded it had tried to erase vast differences of multiculturalism under one centralizing ideology of either religion or monarchic nationalism. In response to growing demands of global geopolitics, China's ongoing cultural revolution serves to bolster Han supremacy and the erasure of less stable multicultural complexities. In the West, the term white itself is an example of this whitewashing and bland destruction of multiculturalism. In the West, the term white itself is an example of this whitewashing and bland destruction of multiculturalism for the sake of bolstering military and economic might, with today's overabundance of Instagram gurus, where we are witness to an excessive fragmentation of ideals within an underlying neoliberal homogeneity. While favoring their strongest ideals as the cement to aid socially, economically, and politically effective forms of unification, so-called modernization required one-dimensional acculturations and state-endorsed educational languages, which generated cultural traumas associated with the irrevocable loss of identities.
If you look at this chart, which measures the world's languages in terms of their size and their state of health, you can see that most languages are ranked in the middle. English, like just a few other dominant languages, is up at the top left-hand corner. It's in a really strong state. But if your language is down here in the bottom right-hand corner of the graph, like Kayu Pulau from Indonesia or Kuraya from Brazil, you are in serious trouble. In the bad old days, governments just banned languages they didn't like. But sometimes the pressure is more subtle. Any teenager growing up in the Soviet Union soon realized that whatever language you spoke at home, mastering Russian was going to be the key to success. Citizens of China, including Tibetans as well as speakers of Shanghainese or Cantonese, face similar pressure today to focus on Mandarin.
English and Mandarin and Spanish are gobbling up languages as people decide they need to have this in order to assimilate into a culture. But if you, instead of feeling awkward about speaking another language, if you were respected for who you are, and if that became part of the fabric, we talk about a multicultural fabric, but it seems that we have to have our multicultures in English.
The European experience of this can be found in the unification of Germany or the consolidation of French through a Collège de France. From the pressures of modern geopolitics, modernity forces cultures to homogenize diversity in favor of unique forms of conservatism, while those who failed in this endeavor, like the Austrian Habsburg regime, disintegrated and continue to haunt us today. Just as we are mired by our rhetorical illusions about computers as being interfaces of so-called multimedia, when they only incorporate the senses related to audio-visual feedback, perhaps we are currently experiencing another polymorphous leap into a homogeneous techno-future. I think the popular term for this is called cyberpunk, and you can see Tolentino's work on the age of Instagram face, how social media, Facetune, and plastic surgery created a single cyborgian look. With homogenization comes translational biases and omissions, which can be traced to even the work of esteemed writers like Max Weber and Hegel. Quoting Ertmann, Jacob Rosel in his monograph Die Hinduismus, Max Weber's, we find the argument that the vision of a society organized around caste was an intellectual construct of Brahmin thinkers, from which the British derived the categories used in their censuses. Like a feedback loop, the censuses, for their part, generated a picture of India in conformity with this Brahmin vision, and the British, through their legislation and judicial decisions, in turn, did all that they could to make Indian society conform to this vision, thereby rendering the caste order into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thus, not only according to Rosel is Weber's analysis tainted by his almost exclusive reliance on sources produced by biased and self-interested groups, but it is built around a social category, caste, the nature and even existence of which prior to British rule cannot be established with the kind of sources Weber draws upon. Personally, I find this fascinating. Thus, Spivak concurs with these problematic Hegelian and consequently Žižekian representations by showing how the version of Hinduism that was put under the microscope is the same, to quote how Hegel describes Hindu deities, monstrosity without aim and measure that is defended by modern Hindu nationalists, the Hindutva. Spivak writes, that an ethnicity untroubled by the vicissitudes of history and neatly accessible as an object of investigation is a confection to which the disciplinary pieties of the anthropologist, the intellectual curiosity of the early colonials, and the European scholars partly inspired by them, as well as the indigenous elite nationalists, by way of the culture of imperialism, contributed their labors, and the proper object of investigation is therefore lost. This is truly a very deep tragedy.
We are not going to recognize this country anymore. That is the truth. What we are talking about and what they are after are Marxist principles.
The fact that colonizers would attempt to find so-called native informants who would speak on behalf of whole continents, especially when their views align with their own interests. And I think Spivak is implicitly talking about Gandhi when she asks us to reflect on Gandhi's stance on the ritual of sati, the immolation of widows. In other cases, colonizers would get specific tribal chiefs to sign a piece of paper to legitimize the suzerainty over and exploitation of the land specified in the treaty in the eyes of other Europeans, a predicament that Zuboff would allegorize to explain modern profit-driven predatory information extraction, where we sign away our rights to use certain software platforms without any meaningful understanding of consent or what we are signing or about privacy policies. Indeed, academic faculties like anthropology were once providing the theoretical basis for political penetration by unwittingly imposing Western forms of Westphalian governmentality. Attempts made by objective outsiders who, placing a culture under a microscope for the purposes of academic study, have helped to oppress.
Quite awful, Gerald. She came down to my hut wearing nothing but a fertility headdress and carrying a husband stick, and I had to participate in the custom.
Well, you'd be morally irresponsible if you did not participate in the custom. You could destroy the entire social structure.
Oh, I felt so terrible about what
Of course you did, Gerald.
I felt terrible 7 times.
But you know, Gerald, I too have a confession.
Do tell.
For Marshall Sullins, economic integration of the whole, the transmission of both grid and code, social differentiation, and objective contrast is assured by the market mechanism, for everyone must buy and sell to live, but they can do so only to the extent that they are powered by their relation to production. Capitalist production is, as much as any other economic system, a cultural specification. The history of anthropology is a sustained sequitur to the contradiction of its existence as a Western science of other cultures. The contradiction is an original condition, a science of man sponsored by a society which, in a way no different from others, exclusively defined itself as humanity and its own order as culture.
Exhibition in Belgium in 1897. Local Congolese spent their days in enclosures imitating village life. Visitors would jeer, laugh at, and ornamentalize them. One journalist who visited the fair wrote, "If there was no reaction, they threw money or bananas over the closure of bamboo."
Even still, this process perhaps allowed society to learn something from others about itself, as Susan Sontag discusses in their commitment to an intensely personal kind of discipline, like psychoanalysis. Anthropologists like Levi-Strauss had perhaps been attempting to save their own souls by a curious and ambiguous act of intellectual catharsis, rather than engaging in an endless pursuit of objective scientific analysis.
Structuralisme, pour ceux qui ne savent pas ce que c'est quoi? C'est un mode de pensée, je sais pas, une méthode d'analyse, une idéologie, qu'est-ce que c'est?
C'est un mot qui a été tellement mis à toutes les sauces, si vous voulez, que moi-même, je n'ose plus l'utiliser.
We love our mother tongue. It's our mother. It's a wonderful language. That's all they know, really. And then I say, hey, but why did English win, eh? Look at this map, eh? This is the little place where we speak Bangla. And everybody in this whole huge place is speaking English. Why did they win? Because they're just 26 letters, man. And they can just do anything with them. You put the E at the end and just cut becomes cute, eh? And plan becomes plain.
Spivak does indeed refute this Hegelian representation exegetically, but summarizing her in-depth analysis is beyond the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish here. What is important for us is her argument that, quote, taken as static and monotonous by Hegel, such summaries are allowed by way of a textual ruse of the self-excusing, unendorsable, erring request endorsed as an indulgence of human error that must nonetheless deny the phenomenality of affect and deny the ground of verification by the so-called concrete lived present. The proper name of the caste stands as a mark to cover over the transition from a tribal society of lineage, where one cannot kill one's own kin, to something more like a state where one's loyalties are to abstracter categories for self-reference. Hegel's interpretation of Hindu thought may very well be that same interpretation that influenced Himmler to supposedly carry a copy of the Bhagavad Gita book in his pocket, as a way of providing the spiritual confidence necessary for his executioners to retain their sanity while simultaneously committing to and maintaining psychological distance from their atrocities. Ironically, this distinctly privileged interpretation is upheld by both Hindutva nationalists, criticized by Hegel and Zizek as being the authoritative source of Hindu thought,
What is Hindutva? Hindutva is basically an ideology which emerged in the last century, basically trying to answer the challenge thrown by the colonialism that is India a nation and our Hindus are a group of people, right? So they basically questioned your fundamental existence because they're looking from the Eurocentric lens and saying that, is India even a nation? What kind of nation you are? Are you a Tamil, Gujarati, or are you a Dalit, or you are a Brahmin, or you are a Jat, or you're a Gujar? What exactly you people are? And second, they question, what is Hindu? Are you people, are you even a religious community or not? So Hindutva emerged as a counter to that, is basically arguing that, well, these people are one. India is a one nation. And it was Hindutva at its core is an anti-imperialist ideology, right? It is answering the Western imperialism. It is countering the resurgent Islamic imperialism as well. So Hindutva is, many people say that, well, Hindutva is politics. Hindutva is not Hinduism. I say Hindutva is the political response of the Hindu society to the political Islam and the Western imperialism. Hindutva seeks to transcend the divisions of caste, language, and also culture, and also other kinds of barriers and differences which Indians have. So in that sense, Hindutva seeks to unite the people as a community. It's not a homogenizing force, right? So if you look at the Hindutva, it's not saying that the local variations or diversity has to go, That was a phase. That was a phase in 30s and 40s when even Congress was saying that we have to become one, we have to have one national dress, one national this thing. The communists were also trying to homogenize people. So that was the trend of that time, that homogenization, but Hindutva has outgrown that. What has happened is in the last few decades, especially after economic reforms, you have this rise of the urban centers. You have the rise of urbanization. And once you have industrialization, once you have urbanization, what's happened that the people are now getting uprooted from their villages and their local communities. Now they have to come and live in the urban center, work in a workplace, maybe industry or a factory together. They're basically being forced to live together, right? So when they were back in their villages, they were living in different tolas, doing different jobs, practicing untouchability and whatnot. But when you are in the urban center, you have no option but to live together, right? So of course there are differences, discrimination even in the urban centers, but over the time what happens, a common culture starts evolving.
We want to get Iran back from the mullah.
Okay, and what do you mean, like, what would you like to see the government change? In what way? What would you like to see? And what do you think the protesters want to see?
We want they go and our Valia come back, the Shah come back. We don't need the mullah. We don't need the stupid, uneducated people to run our country and kill the people and make everybody, suffer, and the corruption and everything. We don't like this regime. We wanted the regime change.
Again, eerily similar stories could be told in many different situations around the world. For example, how Western interpretations of cultures form into overly zealous forms of nationalism for Iranians supporting the prior regime of the Shah in opposition to the mullahs of the present. So the bias is that an interpretation endorsing the simplicity of life and elevation of purpose cannot be disambiguated from a prolonged history of dialectic that is neglected by both an imperceptibility for audiences facing translational issues, while also not having access to the larger conversation taking place. Not to mention the already pre-established political and philosophical goals which an uncontested reading would confirm.
The Associated Press said that Joe Biden is president.
Yeah. Collins' work recognizes plenty of examples where ideals are molded to fit specific socioeconomic or political circumstances. Any in-depth interpretations that affirm the fragmentations of absolutism, as well as any fluid forms of socio-political understandings where, for example, we can find a liberating and flexible vocational definition of caste offered by Krishna, as Spivak talks about, are then buried under the weight of colonial history. Such nuanced and arduous in-depth analyses are then condensed and ignored by a publishing bias towards that which is most easily marketable, which again reiterates the very problem of excessive emotional labor required by civic engagement in democratic societies. Spivak's warnings later returned to clarify notions about the relationship between deconstruction and subjectivity. For her, a deconstructed subjectivity is not the same as the subjectivity composed of these fluid assemblages as argued, for example, by new materialist understandings or proponents of object-oriented ontology like Latour and Morton. Because, and this is important, there was never a claim that the subject was never really there. Whereas these neo-Spinozas argue that the subject had arisen out of the bias of the anthropos, and Johnston affirms the inescapability of subjectivity through a Hegelian transcendental dialectic. From the view of this deconstruction, Spivak explains that the centering of subjectivity is unavoidable as the subject orients itself through play, which for scholars of ritual is what exists in the realm of liminality. Quoting Spivak, indeed, it can be shown by textual analysis that all the so-called post-structuralists at their most theoretical situate subjecting rather than kill the subject or pronounce it dead. Humanism names man, at best the human being, as the master of an unexamined subjective agency. To question this conviction is not to kill the subject. The argument about the subject entailed by deconstruction could be this: the subject is always centered. Deconstruction persistently notices unavoidable centering itself in order to notice that this centering is an effect structure entailing indeterminate boundaries that can only be deciphered as determining. No politics can occupy itself with only this question. This is a devastating critique. Here we turn to the concept of différance, a Derridian term that acquaints an audience to an always present possibility of the deferral and differentiation of the intended meaning of text.
You're very well known in the States for deconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of that idea?
Avant d'essayer de répondre à cette question, je voudrais faire une remarque préliminaire sur le caractère totalement artificiel de cette situation. Je ne sais pas qui regardera ce que nous sommes en train de filmer ou d'enregistrer, mais je voudrais souligner, au lieu de les effacer, ces conditions techniques. Ne pas feindre la naturalité là où elle n'existe pas. J'ai déjà commencé à répondre à votre question sur la déconstruction Parce qu'un des gestes de la déconstruction consiste en particulier à ne pas naturaliser, à ne pas faire comme si ce qui n'est pas naturel était naturel, comme si ce qui est conditionné par l'histoire, par la technique, par l'institution, par la société, était une donnée naturelle.
The very condition of a deconstruction may be at work in the work, within the system to be deconstructed. It may already be located there, already at work. Not at the center, but in an eccentric center, in a corner whose eccentricity assures the solid concentration of the system, participating in the construction of what it, at the same time, threatens to deconstruct. One might then be inclined to reach this conclusion. Deconstruction is not an operation that supervenes afterwards, from the outside, one fine day. It is always already at work in the work. Since the disruptive force of deconstruction is always already contained within the very architecture of the work, all one would finally have to do to be able to deconstruct, given this always already, is to do memory work. Yet since I want neither to accept or to reject a conclusion formulated in precisely these terms, let us leave this question suspended for the moment.
What he refers to as an accumulated reserve is the textual tradition within, where any form of media can be analyzed as a text. For Derrida, there is no originality, no genealogy by which notions of subjectivity are gradually assembled or made to be more susceptible to deconstruction. In every new context and situation, subjectivity is subjectively apprehended, and just as Bradati's example of Olympe de Gouges shows, the woman who wrote about the rights of women, the possibility that the meaning of subjectivity would be both deferred and differing from expectations had existed from their very inception. Any supposedly originary inception of subjectivity emerges conjointly with its own contestation. In the traditions of radical atheism, Zizek, or negative theology, Adorno, this split/contestation within the very inception of a concept, as in the realm of the divine, like in Christ's nihilism on the cross, there is a move to continually dismantle or negate absolutes, which is perhaps an effective source of moral motivation. Negation is the immediate fuel for taking responsibility. Of course, it's not so easy. These dichotomies open up fissures that only reveal further dichotomies, as can be realized with the excellent work of Edward Baring's In the Trace of God, 2015, who expresses skepticism about these negative theologies that always seek to dismantle monads. During a discussion of Henri Birot's Christian interpretation of the Heideggerian tradition, from the section entitled Theism and Atheism at Play, Baring notes, because the rejection of God and being was so absolute, as in the classical deconstructive schema, it came to reintroduce precisely what it had hoped to reject. With his own translation of the work of Birot, Baring traces how a strange duality of finitude and infinitude reverberates through the Western metaphysical tradition. Here I'm quoting Baring's translation of Birot. In Plato's Sophist, Theaetetus is led by a stranger in a meditation on the Parmenidean idea of non-being. The stranger suggests that the very possibility of speaking of non-being, of making claims about it, non-being is, implies that, in a certain manner, it is. But since this non-being cannot be applied to any actual material being, its being can only be located in the realm of ideas. As the stranger elaborated, and in direct opposition to the first meaning of non-being in Greek thought, non-being was the very condition of definition. In this case, as Birot summed up, negativity acts as the essential foundation of discourse. It appears that being itself must mix itself with non-being for philosophy to be possible. Non-being seemed to play both sides of the game of the finite. For the Greeks, infinity lacked and negated finitude, as the Platonic form was something that was unattainable to every particular conception, and the creation story is one of an ordering of formless matter. The Judaic tradition reversed this order by viewing finitude as lacking, negating infinitude, while the infinitude of God created the world ex nihilo. The modernized conception of this relation was an amalgamation of these views between Jerusalem and Athens. Once again, quoting Bari, adopting the hierarchical framework of the Greek, the infinite is a degraded form of the finite, but the polarity of the Judaic, it is the finite rather than the infinite that participates in nothingness. The modern conception of finitude considered the finite as a fall, shoot from the infinite. Descartes was able to bring these two aspects together by casting the infinity of the will as the refusal or forgetting of the same finite. Finitude was thus a negation of the original negation that was finite being, because it posed our limits as in principle surpassable. In the way, the concept of finitude allowed for freedom from all constraints. Finitude's freedom was the freedom of negativity, and yet because this infinity of human will still remained infinitely far from the divine, bit by bit it will be constrained to think itself as a primitive fact, as the foundation without foundation of the very humanity of man, now determined no longer as son of God, but as subject. It was, then, just a small step from the Christian idea of finitude to atheistic thought and the death of God. Atheism set itself the task of overturning this earlier Christian philosophy by rejecting the idea of a prior infinite and interpreting finitude as originary. In this atheistic and humanist conception, finitude was the positive condition for freedom, a yearning to overcome finite limitations, an opening to the indefinite and the unlimited. This yearning to overcome limits is perhaps directly opposed to modern environmental movements that seek to impose limits. This yearning to overcome limits showed how atheistic thought maintained the same essential structure of the Christian idea of finitude, since atheistic finitude still experienced the finite as something to be overcome. It maintained the sense of the finite as a mal, a pain, or evil. The secular idea of human infinite freedom caught within a finite form was merely a secularization of Christian sin and culpability, a development and distortion of the Judeo-Christian idea of the fall. As Birot wrote, "What then is this infinity of free finitude, if not an irreligious and Promethean infinite of man, who, in making himself God, makes himself man by the transgression of sin?" Though this atheistic evaluation attempts to split the monad, it also takes for granted that this process of splitting is itself the worship of a new, fragmented absolute. This is the minimum idealism that Zizek is referring to when he says, "Infinity acquires its first actual existence the moment a cell's membrane starts to function as a self-boundary. Here we encounter the minimum idealism, which defines the notion of self. A self is precisely an entity without any substantial density, without any hard kernel that would guarantee its consistency. If we penetrate the surface of an organism and look deeper into it, we never encounter some central controlling element that would be itself, secretly pulling the strings of its organs. The consistency of the self is thus purely virtual. It is as if it were an inside which appears only when viewed from the outside. Like on the interface screen, the moment we penetrate the interface and endeavor to grasp the self substantially, as it is in itself, it disappears like sand between our fingers. Thus, materialist reductions who claim that there really is no self are right, but they nonetheless miss the point. At the level of material reality, inclusive of the psychological reality of inner experience, there is, in effect, no self. The self is not the inner kernel of an organism, but a surface effect. A, quote, true, quote, human self functions, in a sense, like a computer screen. What is behind is nothing but a network of selfless neuronal machinery, referring back to Pascal.
Here's the TV and the cat, played back at 25, this is how it would be perceived in real time. And now at 1600 frames a second, you can actually see the scan line moving from the top to the bottom. You'll notice that on a CRT screen, it's only the active line of pixels that's bright, and your persistence of vision will actually build that into a complete image.
Hegel's thesis that subject is not substance has thus to be taken quite literally. In the opposition between the corporeal material processes and the pure sterile appearance, subject is appearance itself, brought to its self-reflection. It is something that exists only insofar as it appears to itself. This is why it is wrong to search behind the appearance of the true core of subjectivity. Behind it there is precisely nothing, just a meaningless natural mechanism with no depth to it. In the work of Humberto Motorena and Francisco Varela, linking Heideggerian teleology with the development of the concept of autopoiesis, the particular attempts to emancipate the universal from within its own finitude. An autopoietic machine is a machine organized, defined as a unity, as a network of processes of production, transformation and destruction, of components that produce the components which, first through their iterations and transformations, continuously regenerate and realize the network of processes and relations that produce them, and two, constitute it, the machine, as a concrete unity in the space in which they, the components, exist by specifying the topological domain of its realization as such a network. In Ritual in its own right, Don Handelman also notices the affinities between the study of ritual and the study of autopoiesis. Handelman explains, "I suggest then that within ritual forms, autopoietic qualities of self-organization and qualities of complexity go hand in hand. Perhaps the greater the degree of interior complexity within a ritual, the greater will be its tendency to self-organization. And so, the greater the tendency of self-organization, the greater the capacity of the ritual for temporary autonomy from its socio-cultural surroundings. Then, one step further, the greater this relative autonomy, the greater the capacity of the ritual to interiorize the distinction between itself and its surround, and so to act on the latter from within itself through the dynamics of the ritual design.
And a leading theory as to where sentience happens in the world. Some people say, oh, you need a brain. Some people say, oh, you need a nervous system. But a major viewpoint, first put out by two fellows from Chile named Maturana and Varela, their theory of what defines life is called Autopoiesis. And they define life using this approach that says something is alive that has a bounded structure, that has a porous membrane dividing inside and outside, that there are processes of sensing what's outside, integrating that information, processing it, and then responding. And everything that's alive does that, whether it's a single-cell organism or something as complicated as us or whales or dolphins or elephants, or ecosystems, potentially, although whether it extends to a planet, for example, they weren't sure about that. I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting question. So they said, wherever you find life, you find mind. It's not about a nervous system, it's about being alive. And that even a single cell has a very simple form of mind. Well, the complexity theory work I've been doing, it's all about how groups of interacting individuals self-organize into larger scale structures if they fulfill a handful of simple criteria. And ant colonies are really good ways to explain this. So you need a lot of ants. 3 ants don't make an ant colony. 25 do. If you buy one of those little ant colonies from the back of a comic book, they come with 25 ants. And they build tunnels, and they make food lines, and they even make a little cemetery when ants die that they can put them, which is as far away from the colony and from the food source as possible. And it turns out if you watch ant colonies, 25, they do all these organizational things, but by the time more than half of them have died, they no longer build the cemetery. And then by the time there are 3, they're no longer really doing anything. So you have to have a certain number to get this self-organization. And the more you have, the more complex the self-organization. So 100 ants isn't the same as 1,000 ants, isn't as complicated as a 10,000 ant colony. A village isn't a city, isn't a megalopolis. There have to be feedback loops in the system that are called homeostatic, negative feedback loops. So, like the thermostat in a room. It's set so that the heat comes on until the temperature reaches a certain level, and then when it reaches that, it turns off, and the room cools down then until it gets too cold, and then it gets turned on again. So a negative feedback loop keeps things in a constant range, though it oscillates within that range. Positive feedback loop would be as if the hotter the room gets, the more the heat turns on. And you can have those in complex systems, but they can't predominate. If they predominate, you can get self-organization sometimes, but instead of being adaptive and alive, which is the hallmark of complex systems, instead they're energy expending and self-limited. So you could think hurricanes, tornadoes, economic bubbles, war fever, socially. And for me, from my perspective of applying to cells, cancer is a good example. No ant in the colony is paying attention to whether the whole colony has enough food. So there's no member of the colony is really truly monitoring what's going on at the global level. Some members may think they are, think politicians, but they're often wrong. Though what they're perceiving and how they're behaving can influence the self-organization, but there is no true global sensing. And finally, there has to be a low level of randomness in the system. If there's no randomness, then the system will self-organize always in precisely the same way. So the ant colony will always form the same structures. But then if there's another ant colony that comes in, there's no way for it to find a new way to self-organize in response to that competition. or if the weather changes and the food source changes, there's no way to change the self-organization to accommodate. But if you have too much randomness, then you don't get any self-organization. So you need this low-level randomness in the system. And this was actually my entry point into complexity, because the early evidence that adult stem cells in humans can sort of be as flexible as embryonic stem cells, which was what my opening salvos in the stem cell world were all about. And that's where a lot of controversy came from, because then you get into the adult versus embryonic stem cell debate. The early evidence showed that this happened. Bone marrow cells, what we were looking at, could become liver cells or lung cells or skin cells, cells of virtually any tissue in the body. But very rarely, unless there's really severe injury of a particular type that would trigger it. So mostly we were finding 1 in 10,000 liver cells, 1 in 1,000 skin cells would be coming from the bone marrow. And at first people sort of rejected that as, well, then it's trivial. So it's not physiologically important. Well, you know, just because it doesn't happen often, if it does happen, it means we can manipulate it, so it's still useful. That was one of my early arguments. But it did raise a question, why is this there? And then I started to realize, once I started learning about complexity theory, oh, this was an example of that low-level randomness in the system. That having that little bit of flexibility meant that when the right challenge to the system came along, it could turn into something more robust that could actually repair tissues. So with the ant colony, from a distance, an ant line always looks like a straight line. But you know, if you bend down and look closely, there's always like 3 to 5% of the ants that aren't following the line. And when I was a kid, these would be the occasional ant that would wander into my mom's kitchen, and she'd be ready to call the exterminator. And if I saw the ant before she saw it, I always felt sorry for it, because I thought, oh, poor, stupid, evolutionarily maladaptive ant who came into the wrong place. You want to be outside, and I would get him on a piece of paper. I was a proto-Buddhist then, I suppose, and I would carry him outside. But she was right, because those divergent ants, if the food source for the food line runs out, it's the ants not following the line that are most rapidly going to find a new food source, like in my mother's kitchen, and establish a new line into her kitchen. So she was actually more adaptive in this situation than I was. So that's what makes a complex system. So we showed that cells fulfill all those functions, and that meant our bodies were self-organizing cells, and not just our human cells. In any human body, estimates are we have 4 trillion human cells, but our body as a whole has about 400 trillion cells. Only 1% of them are human, and the rest are the bacteria that line your skin, all the surface that are exposed to the outside, and all the surfaces inside. So from your mouth all the way out the other end, it's all bacteria. And without those bacteria, we wouldn't survive for more than a few days after birth. The bacteria that line the creases of all your joints are stable, and they're very specific types of bacteria, and they digest the dying skin cells, and when they digest the cell membranes, they create lanolin that lubricates the joints. That's why your skin doesn't crack. And if, as a baby, you didn't have those bacteria, your skin would crack, you'd get infections, and you wouldn't live very long. Your GI tract can't form its structures without the bacteria. The genome doesn't code for the absorptive surface of the interior of the GI tract. It codes for an interaction with the bacteria lining your GI tract. And out of those two things, your absorptive surface is created. So the boy in the bubble who grows up without bacteria in the environment because their immune system can't handle it also can't digest food. If you grow a mouse in an environment like that, same thing. But then you put bacteria in their gut, and within days to weeks, they suddenly develop an absorptive surface that allows them to function. So our human bodies aren't functioning human bodies without 100 times more cells that have nothing to do with your human cells. So the body at a lower level of scale is like an ant colony made of bacteria and human cells, maybe a few other kinds of creatures, fungal spores perhaps, but mostly it's bacteria and human cells. So cells self-organize into bodies. Bodies self-organize into ant colonies if the bodies are ants. If they're humans, they organize into cities, cultures, political systems, etc. And that immediately implies then that complex systems can exist in hierarchies. So from a distance, I may see an ant colony or a flock of birds, and it will look like a solid shape, a moving shape, but it'll look like a solid thing. And if you ever see a flock of birds from a distance when you weren't necessarily expecting it, you might actually think, what's that thing in the sky? And everything that's alive does that, whether it's a single-cell organism or something as complicated as us or whales or dolphins or elephants, or ecosystems, potentially, although whether it extends to a planet, for example, they weren't sure about that. I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting question.
In Political Affect, we find a translation of Varela's work by John Pertovi, which is a parallel to Zizek's spiritualist warning about resuscitating traditions. We find in it Varela's hesitation regarding the use of autopoiesis on a meso or macro level, or socio-political level of analysis. Quote, I am absolutely against all extensions of autopoiesis and also against the move to think of society according to models of emergence, even though, in a certain sense, you are not wrong in thinking things like that. But it is an extremely delicate passage. I refuse to apply autopoiesis to the social plane. That might surprise you, but I do so for political reasons. History has shown that biological holism is very interesting and has produced great things, but it has always had its dark side, a black side. Each time it has allowed itself to be applied to a social model. There are always slippages towards fascism, towards authoritarian impositions, eugenics, and so on. At this point, I'm going to go off script for a second and say, it's already being done, Professor Varela. It's being done by China, it's being done all over the world by authoritarian regimes. In attempting to ascertain a theory of political affect, Pertovi describes the limitations of autopoietic theory since. Pertovi writes, the differences lie in Varela's conception of autopoiesis as synchronically emergent, which locks out the sort of diachronic emergence we need in understanding the development of bodies politic. If one could think of the formation of second-order bodies politic using dynamic systems conceptually, even if we will never be able to model rigorously such hugely complex systems, if one could see them as resolutions or a dynamic differential field, then we would at least have the possibility of an extremely delicate passage in thinking of political change. But without that possibility of novel production modeled by dynamic systems, then autopoietic social systems, once formed and mature, construct a world only in their own image, and when locked in conflict with another such system, cannot ascend to the observer status that would see them both as parts of a larger social system.
So that's my formula. Not let's tolerate all that they are doing because of the higher struggle against whatever. No. What we should do is desperately fight for somehow, I know it's difficult, but bringing together our struggles, gay rights, whatever you want, abortion and so on, and their rights. If we make any compromises here, either the Western cultural imperialist compromise, fuck their rights, they are too primitive, we should just impose on them our struggles, this is horrible. And I will give you a funny example which happened in ex-Yugoslavia 20 years ago when the war was going on in Bosnia. Some Bosnian feminists showed me a letter they received from some American feminists who wanted to show sympathy for Bosnians, poor women, victims of rape. And in order to establish communication, they sent them a questionnaire, a letter. And it was so implicitly racist. Like, first question was, do you, like the kind of vulgarized Judith Butler, do you think that woman has an eternal essence, or do you think that feminine identity is performatively constructed through discursive practices and so on? You see my point. If cultural imperialism exists, this is it. But on the other hand, I also reject this Mugabe China line, which is, you know, if we do what we do to our women and so on, this is our specific way of life and so on. I think everything depends on bringing together these two. These two dimensions. And I can guarantee you it can be done. Otherwise, all the talk of respect is bullshit.
I say kill Wakanda. Guess what? Hey,
destruction of private property. It's against the law.
Somebody gets raped by somebody, and they're like, I'm a 16-year-old and I can't have this baby. Think you should keep it?
It's a baby.
Yeah.
If someone was raped and she gave birth and she decided to kill her 3-year-old child.
I meant to get your phone.
Someone call the cops.
Meant to kick your phone.
Do not touch me. Someone call the cops.
I meant to.
Posing as men to invade the male-only pool.
Female swimming pond there, male swimming pond here. That's the way it has always been.
Instead, the two conflicting systems are locked in fratricidal combat, producing a torn civic body politic, producing civil war.
The stunt was organised by Hannah Clark.
We protest about bathrooms and we protest about changing rooms, but those aren't the big deals, are there? It's places where women are vulnerable that are a big problem. So prisons and hospital wards and refuges are a massive issue.
It wasn't easy finding Jess. Most trans people we approached were reluctant to go on camera, some scared of repercussions, others refusing to appear on a programme alongside the feminists.
Trans people are very, very scared of talking publicly about trans issues. Like, I know that simply by doing this piece of media that I will be hounded on social media. It's actually a really hostile time for trans people. One of the things about the Gender Recognition Act debate and consultation is that it's kind of given license to anti-trans activists to kind of spark a public debate about trans identities and trans people in a way that has felt very violent.
Protevi, Varela, and the rest are understandably hesitant to speak of civil war in all its radicality. This is why Bradati's question of who and how many are we, and are we in this together, is crucial. While epistemological aporias and empathy gaps separate those who work to create and those who work to dismantle, Latour takes great pains to show that we are not in this together. Thanks to America's abandonment of the climate agreement, we know clearly that the war has been declared. We may be in this predicament together, but we are not one. In their editor's introduction to the work Universal Exception, 2006, both Zizek and Jean Baudrillard respond to the collective affective resonance emanating through the media after 9/11. They both advise a time for reflection. As per the advice given by Chaudhry, perhaps we must take the time to breathe, reflect upon the myriad biases that subsume us, and do the hard work of being conscientious of our interactions with each other and our ecology. However, having obviously failed in such endeavors of institutional translation and emotional labor, after 9/11, we once again retreated back into fueling cycles of violence, the consequences of which continue to reverberate throughout the Middle East today.
He was open to the idea of imprisoning skeptics, global warming, as war criminals. Is that the choice? Bellevue or Nuremberg? Bill Nye joins us now. Bill, it's great to see you. That doesn't sound like science to me, Bill Nye the Science Guy. That sounds like something very different.
So cognitive dissonance is not a delusion, it's a feature. It's human nature.
So we in the science community are looking for an explanation why climate change deniers, or extreme skeptics, do not accept the overwhelming scientific evidence for climate change. And the most reasonable explanation is you have a worldview, and then you have evidence, and the evidence disagrees with your worldview, so you deny the evidence, and then along with that, you deny the authorities that are providing the evidence.
It is not difficult to find evidence of ontotheological war involving implanted rituals from continually reiterated forms of coloniality. Perhaps the right calls it a culture war. The difficulty is to disambiguate the actual theaters of war without being bogged down by obscurantism, since we live in a Huxleyan dystopia.
If you consider the fact that this system, this capitalist system under which we're living today, is designed in such a way that nobody except a privileged few can attempt to express themselves or contribute to anything, there's no doubt about the fact that we have to talk about revolutionizing the system before anybody can live in any kind of human fashion together. I would just like to point out the fact that I have seen with my eyes societies where people of different colors have learned how to live together, each maintaining their own cultural identity, but each fighting to build and to continue to construct a socialist revolution together.
Ironically, this metaphorical field of ontotheological war seems to be a subject of agreement between these two sets of extremists, as explained by Zizek. Quote, "The way Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson react to the events of September 11, perceiving them as a sign that God had withdrawn his protection from the United States because of the sinful lives of the Americans, putting the blame on hedonist materialism, liberalism, and rampant sexuality, and claiming that America got what it deserved."
God will not be mocked, and when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
Well, I totally concur.
Osama bin Laden in 2010 laid out his plan to kill the President of the United States, saying Obama is the head of infidelity.
The fact that this very same condemnation of liberal America as the one from the Muslim other came from the very heart of America should give us food for thought. This is why Zizek is weary of agreeing with a theological war, which may lead to an even worse madness of religious fundamentalism, because while we become mired amongst ourselves, dealing with the fallout of our many squabbles amongst each other, while those privileged enough not to be mired in this obscurantism are simultaneously fueling it from the outside as they make themselves comfortable in their lifeboats.
Spreading in our midst. Shout! Shout! Shout out his name!
Perhaps this we, if it exists, need to find a third pill, as Zizek says, an option from an absurd outside.
Of course, Matrix is a machine for fictions, but these are fictions which already structure our reality. If you take away from our reality the symbolic fictions that regulate it, you lose reality itself.
I want a third pill.
To avoid getting caught in the games that we have already become so accustomed to, an option outside the dichotomy between an obedient engagement with the facade of civic life or its wholesale demolition on the other. I propose that rather than sustaining the purely individualist perspective from the cross upon high, this third pill comes in the form of a revolution returning to the efficacy of sacrifice from the perspective of communion. For Zizek, the third pill is found through a repetition which loses all familiarity, yet still originates from the inside, where the motivation may be formulated.
They expect us to lose heart or to fight back. We will do neither.
Quote, "The question of freedom is, at its most radical, the question of how this closed circle of fate can be broken. The answer, of course, is that it cannot be broken, because it is not truly closed, because there are cracks in its texture, but, on the contrary, because it is overclosed. That is, because the subject's very endeavor to break out of it is included in it in advance. That is to say, since our attempts to assert our freedom and escape fate are themselves instruments of fate, the only real way to escape fate is to renounce these attempts, to accept fate as inexorable. In a way, we can never escape the cycle of ritual. Oedipus's fate, killing his father, marrying his mother, was realized through his parents' very attempt to avoid it. Without this attempt to avoid fate, fate cannot realize itself."
They walked, both Hindu and Muslim alike, with heads held high, without any hope of escape from injury or death. It went on and on into the night. Stop. Women carried the wounded and broken bodies from the road until they dropped from exhaustion. Stop. But still, it went on and on. Stop. Whatever moral ascendancy the West held was lost here today. India is free, for she has taken all that steel and cruelty can give, and she has neither cringed nor retreated. Stop.